The nature of the relationship between Russia and China is actually one that I think the vast majority of people get wrong. And I think that most people get this wrong because their understanding of Russia and China's relationship comes from surface level headlines, rather than an actual thorough analysis of the underlying details behind those headlines. When it comes to surface level headlines, most media would have us believe that Russia and China are ideological allies, two countries that are in it to win it in a fight against the West. Two countries that will never separate from each other, that will never betray each other, and that will do everything they can to support each other. But it turns out that when you actually look deeper at the details of this relationship, we see something completely different. We see allies and partners of mere convenience, allies and partners with long-standing grievances who, if for the short term they appear to be partnering together, that is only because for the short term it is in each other's interests to do so. Today is an important day to be talking about this, because today is one of those days where the surface level headlines have a lot of people worried about the relationship between Russia and China, where in reality the details behind those headlines are extremely underwhelming. And they don't show us a strong partnership, but rather they show us a desperate Russia who is now ready to concede to the massive demands of China because they have no other options. What I'm talking about, of course, is a flurry of deals that have recently come out of talks between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, as the world press is now advertising a very strong relationship between Russia and China, but where I actually see something quite different. And the key detail of these deals is, of course, the energy pipeline between Russia and China that Russia and China have been negotiating for a very, very long time, but that they have been unable to arrive at a deal on. And now it appears that Russia and China have arrived at a deal, and people are very worried that this is going to bail out the Russian economy and that China is actually actively trying to support the Russian economy to keep them going and really to help Russia survive as a nation. I, however, see something much different, and that's what I want to talk about in today's video. Now, as we dive in, I have no doubt that you will be hearing details in this video that you will not hear in many other places. But at the same time, I also have no doubt that as you hear them, they will ring very true. And the reason that I'm able to keep doing independent analysis like this, exploring different angles that you really won't hear in the mainstream media, is because of support from viewers like you who are watching this video. So if you want to support this channel, do please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Those things are both completely free, but also consider becoming a channel member or a patron to continue keeping this work going. That said, let's dive in, and let's start with some brief context on the relationship between Russia and China throughout the war in Ukraine, because that context is very important to understand what has actually happened this week. But most people writing articles about what happened this week are only focused on what happened this week, and that is what I think is leading a lot of people to the wrong answers. Russia and China have had a very interesting relationship when it comes to the war in Ukraine, and it has not been nearly as friendly as most people think it is. In fact, I would compare the relationship between Russia and China in the war in Ukraine to the relationship between the United States and Ukraine in the same war, where the United States seems interested in helping Ukraine only insofar as they can get benefits for themselves, and they are actually being very adversarial towards Ukraine in a lot of different ways. I would say the same thing is true of China's approach to Russia, but China's approach to Russia is actually even more adversarial than the United States towards Ukraine, although with China you don't see that in the language they use towards Russia, but instead you see it in their actual actions towards Russia. China has, of course, given Russia some support to help them in their war effort, but that support really has not been overwhelming. It has not been enough support to help Russia decisively win the war, similar to the United States and Ukraine, but really only enough support to actually keep Russia in the fight. And I would argue that a potential reason for this is that China actually wants to see Russia become weakened, and the best way for Russia to become weaker is for Russia to prolong their war against Ukraine as long as possible, because the longer that war goes on, the more Russia wastes resources militarily and also economically. And we have seen this play out in a number of different ways. And on top of this, we have also seen China take advantage of Russia several times because of the weak position that they currently find themselves in. For example, as Russia has been fighting against Ukraine, China has taken advantage of this opportunity to quietly claim some territory from Russia in Russia's far east. And it's a really small piece of territory for now, but it's a strategically significant piece of territory that Russia and China have disputed for a very long time. I have a full analysis of this and other events surrounding this and several other videos on this channel. I don't want to go on too long of a rabbit trail here other than to point out that China has taken this land from Russia, and Russia has been basically forced to diplomatically cede it to them. Perhaps not officially on a map, but Russia has been forced to allow China to develop the land, which is something that they have been vehemently opposed to for a very long time. But this is not the only concession that China has gotten out of Russia while Russia is in this weakened state against Ukraine. And that, in fact, brings us to the recent talks between China and Russia, where a lot of people see this deal that has been signed as a sign of a big strategic partnership, where in reality, it is a massive concession of Russia giving something to China, probably basically for free, because they simply have no other options. What's important to realize about the recent energy deal between China and Russia is that this is not an event that has emerged out of the blue, but in fact, this is an event that has been being negotiated for a very long time, even prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Those negotiations ramped up after Russia invaded Ukraine and Russia lost its European markets, and they became rather desperate to sell more energy to China. But here we are over 3 years into this conflict, and China still has not agreed to this. China has agreed to purchase energy from Russia in some instances, but this has usually been at massive discounts, sometimes discounts as high as 50%. And when it comes to the new pipeline that has now been agreed to, the Power of Siberia 2, or at least has been agreed to in principle, that'll become important in a second, the same theme applies. The key aspects here are discount and delay, where every time China goes into a new energy deal with Russia, the first thing they do is demand a massive discount. And the second thing they do is delay that process for as long as possible. These are both very impactful. And for both reasons, it means that when China purchases more energy from Russia, they are not actually bailing out the Russian economy. First, because when they buy at a discount, they are buying at prices so low that while it might help the Russian economy a little bit, it's not going to make a significant difference. And second, there is the delay. Because even if China and Russia sign a deal today, which apparently they have, or at least a memorandum of understanding, that does not mean that energy trade between China and Russia starts increasing today. And in fact, it might not actually increase for more than a decade. That's because no matter what you want to do, you can't simply deliver energy to another country overnight. Energy deliveries are dependent on capacity, and that is capacity in tankers and capacity in pipelines. And for a long time, Russia has been basically maxed out in the capacity that they can actually sell to China, particularly natural gas through pipelines. And in order for Russia to actually sell more to China and actually profit more from selling to China, they need to build additional pipelines in order to handle the additional capacity. Now, I know for a lot of you, this is going to seem like basic stuff. Why am I mansplaining this to you? But unfortunately, a lot of people seem to be missing this basic stuff, which is the fact that with China and Russia entering an energy deal today, that is not actually going to help Russia in their war against Ukraine. But in fact, all it is going to do is position China for a future where they can buy more Russian energy. A future in timelines that are far longer than could actually help Russia win their war, unless Russia plans to fight for another decade, and Russia just simply does not have the capacity to fight that long, at least not with their current style of fighting, and not with the recent strikes that Ukraine has begun against Russia, assuming that these types of strikes continue. Put another way, if China's actual goal was to help the Russian economy survive, if China's actual goal was to keep Russia on the map as a geopolitical ally, if China's actual goal was to keep Russia strong for as long as possible through energy purchases, China would have entered into an energy deal with Russia over 3 years ago, not today. China would have started helping Russia the moment that Russia lost their energy partners in Europe. Because from the moment of signing the deal to the moment that China can actually begin purchasing energy and actually helping the Russian economy, there is a very long delay. And in that delay period, not only is Russia not earning income, but Russia is actually forced to spend more money in completing the energy infrastructure on their side of the pipeline. China, clearly though, does not have this as their primary goal. China's primary goal is something else, and that primary goal has been seen clearly throughout the energy negotiations thus far. For example, not long ago, China and Russia were having these same conversations, and they each basically told each other, no. Where China told Russia, we will allow you to connect your Power of Siberia to pipeline to us, but only if you give us the same subsidized rate that you give to your own citizens, which is a rate so low that Russia basically would not make any profits, but it would allow Russia to keep pumping energy so that their infrastructure didn't freeze up in the winter. This was not China trying to help Russia. This was China trying to use Russia's moment of weakness for maximum buying leverage. And at that time, Russia was so offended that they said no to this as well, and there was no deal. Today, though, things have changed. And the reason I think things have changed and that China and Russia have finally agreed to a deal is because they are both now more desperate. Russia is more desperate because the war has continued, and Ukraine is ramping up energy strikes, and Russia is realizing that they really need somebody else to send energy to as fast as possible, or else they're going to be forced to shut infrastructure offline that is going to start freezing. And China is a little bit more desperate because the Western world, particularly the United States, has put tariffs on China, which is pushing China more into Russia's arms and making China more willing to actually sign a deal with Russia. However, even with this being stated, we still cannot see what China has done with Russia today as impactful in any sense of the word. First and foremost, because Russia and China don't actually really have a deal yet. All they have is a memorandum of understanding. And if you know anything about Russia and China when it comes to memorandums of understanding, they don't exactly take those seriously. Russia famously signed a memorandum of understanding in Ukraine back in the 1990s. That not only would they not invade Ukraine, but that they would actually intervene to protect Ukraine if Ukraine was ever invaded. And so that shows you how seriously Russia takes these legally binding types of agreements. And we could see similar things from China, although not as extreme as invasions, but where they don't actually see a memorandum of understanding as legally binding. And so that's all Russia and China have reached thus far. Even more than that, Russia and China, even with the level of deal that has been reached, have not agreed to the two most important pieces of the deal. They have not agreed on the timeline, and they have not agreed on the pricing, or at least they have not agreed to announce the pricing. Part of me thinks that maybe they have agreed on the pricing, and that it is at an extremely low rate because Russia is simply desperate. And we can see this from some of the statements on the Russian side, where they have said, we're not announcing pricing yet, but basically expect lower pricing than you get when we sell to Europe because the gas is closer to China than it is to Europe or something like that, which doesn't actually really make a ton of sense. It only makes a small amount of sense, but it seems more like the Russian government and Gazprom, the company that is doing this, is trying to seed this idea into the public consciousness before they actually reveal just how low the pricing is. Because I have a feeling that this pricing is the same subsidized rate that Russian citizens get that will basically not allow Russia to actually profit the original deal that China offered to Russia. With all of these specific details in place, we see that the only thing that Russia has actually gotten so far out of this gas deal with China is the right to start spending their limited resources to build this pipeline. And if you don't see where I'm going with this already, let me spell it out for you. There is a very real chance that China actually has no intention of ever buying Russian energy. There is a very real chance that China is simply signing a deal with Russia right now to continue the strategy towards Russia that they have had throughout the entire war. Give them just enough to keep them fighting. Give them just enough to keep them spending their resources so that Russia continues to find themselves in a weaker and weaker state, where China can take advantage of that in a number of different ways. They could take advantage of it directly through a military invasion. If it sounds extreme, watch my 36-minute video on the subject. I explain it in a lot of detail. Or they could take advantage of it indirectly, kind of what we're seeing here, with economic coercion, recognizing their leverage over Russia and potentially making a deal to buy Russian land from Russia, or a deal to control Russian land, even if they don't technically own it as the country. One of the reasons this is so significant is because China will absolutely need this Russian energy if they ever want to attack Taiwan. A lot of people don't realize, but one of the big reasons China probably will not attack Taiwan anytime soon is because China is highly dependent on global supply chains to get their energy that would easily be cut off if China did make a move against Taiwan. China does not have a whole lot of energy domestically. They are very dependent on imports. And the fact that they have not increased supplies from Siberia to make up for this up to this point shows me that they're probably not planning something against Taiwan anytime soon. But perhaps in the long term, if they can get Russia to pay for the pipeline that they will eventually try to control themselves, or if they can get Russia to continue to sell them energy at rock bottom prices because the pipeline's already built and China is the only possible customer from that pipeline, if they can get control of the pipeline in either of those ways, that would actually help China in their future geopolitical goals, which actually is a little bit troublesome for the long term, although it is helpful today in the immediate crisis of Russia's war against Ukraine. Long story short, China and Russia's relationship absolutely cannot be understood through a surface-level analysis of time-boxed media headlines that only look at the current week or the current month. China absolutely will use Russia in whatever way they can. They will use them to get cheaper energy. They will use them to weaken their international partners. They will potentially use Russia even to weaken Russia itself. And they will use Russia to generate media headlines to try to show that they have geopolitical strength when they are facing other geopolitical problems, for example, a trade war with the United States. But when it comes to the nature of China actually being able to help Russia, and actually wanting to help Russia, what you need to look at are not the nice words that China and Russia throw at each other, but rather the actual concrete realities of how energy physically moves across physical territory from Russian gas wells, from Russian oil wells, all the way to Chinese cities. If those physical realities do not exist, and if those physical realities are not changing, the relationship between China and Russia is only words, and they can't actually do very much that is meaningful to each other. As I said earlier, I have much more in-depth analysis on the relationship between Russia and China in other videos, and so I definitely recommend you check those out if you're interested in this topic at all, or if you find that I am raising questions in your mind that you haven't heard other people asking. That in mind, I did say at the beginning of this video as well that I would present to you information that you're not hearing in a whole lot of other places, but that when you heard it, it would ring true. If I fulfilled that promise, and you're finding that I am bringing you information that you are not getting in mainstream media, I would ask that you would consider supporting this channel. First, by liking this video and subscribing to the channel, both of which are completely for free, but also consider becoming a channel member or a patron of this channel. I don't expect paid support from anybody, but it really does help me out. It really does help keep these videos going. It really helps fund the consistent research and production behind these videos and allows me to get more of these analyses out to you much faster. To learn more about that, just follow the links in the description of this video. Thank you so much for watching today, and be sure to check out one of these videos on screen.